Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Jasmine Reed, and I am 34 years old. The night I walked away from my marriage did not involve shouting, tears, or doors slamming off their hinges. It ended at a quiet corner table in a Chicago restaurant that used to feel like the center of my world. Damon Reed, my husband of 8 years, sat across from me, where he had once slid a ring onto my finger and promised we would grow old together. Now, that same table was where we sat to let the marriage die in public while pretending everything was civil. He arrived late, wearing a navy suit and the same cologne he had worn the night he proposed, as if muscle memory had dressed him instead of intention. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He slid into the chair opposite me, phone already in his hand, thumbs moving as if the night were just one more meeting on his calendar. His drink arrived before his eyes ever really met mine. Even then, he glanced up like he was trying to remember why he was there. I did not need to ask who he was texting. I already knew. Her name was Sierra Lawson, his secretary, the person who started as help and slowly shifted into replacement while I was still legally his wife. I watched the faint upward curl at the corner of his mouth as he read something on the screen. The tiny private smile I used to think belonged to me. It was like standing outside my own house, watching the lights on in the window, knowing someone else was inside. When the waiter came, I ordered his favorite meal out of habit, not affection. Medium-rare steak, garlic mashed potatoes, roasted asparagus. I hated that I did it automatically, hated that my hands still moved according to the patterns of a life that no longer fit me. Damon did not notice the effort. He barely looked up. He just nodded, murmured, "That's fine," and went back to his phone, knife and fork later, moving with the same detached efficiency he used in boardrooms. For a while, we ate in almost complete silence. The restaurant hummed around us. Soft music, muted laughter, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversations that sounded more alive than anything between us. At the table next to us, a couple leaned close over shared dessert, arms brushing, eyes locked. I remembered sitting like that with Damon in this very spot, leaning in as if the rest of the world did not exist. Now, I could barely feel him across the small round table. "I am leaving Chicago," I said finally, my voice steady, my hands flat on the linen tablecloth. I watched the words cross the space between us and land somewhere behind his eyes. "I am moving to a small coastal town in North Carolina. Harbor Pine. I am starting over." For the first time that evening, Damon actually looked at me. Surprise flickered across his face like a light someone forgot to turn off. It lasted only a second before indifference settled back in. "Do whatever you want," he said, rolling his shoulders like he was loosening a tie that was not there. He set his fork down, wiped his mouth, then added, "Sierra and I are planning our wedding. She knows how to make me happy." He said it calmly, like he was confirming a hotel reservation. No apology. No regret. Just a statement. An announcement that my replacement was already firmly in place. The words did not hit me like a punch. They landed like confirmation of a truth I had already accepted. People assume the end of a marriage is a single explosion, a scandal, a fierce argument, a dramatic discovery. My marriage did not shatter in one moment. It eroded quietly, grain by grain, until one day I realized there was nothing solid left to stand on. In the beginning, Damon and I were a team. We were young and ambitious, two people in our 20s who believed hard work and love could build anything. He was trying to prove himself in finance. I was finishing my master's degree in interior design. We rented a small apartment on the west side, slept on a mattress on the floor for 6 months, and treated takeout as a celebration. I believed in him when no one else took him seriously. I stayed up late helping him review presentations, edited his emails, listened to him rehearse the speeches he gave to people who thought he was reaching too far. When his career started to gain traction, I was proud. I thought we were both rising. I did not realize that in his mind, only one of us was. As his promotions came, something in Damon shifted. His schedule filled with late-night meetings, weekend calls, and emergency strategy sessions that suspiciously coincided with birthdays and anniversaries. At first, he apologized. He brought flowers. He promised it was temporary. "This is how we get ahead, Jazz," he would tell me, loosening his tie at midnight while I sat on the couch with a cold plate of food on the coffee table. "Everything I am doing is for us." But over time, his language changed. "I have to be on," he said once, scrolling through work emails while I tried to tell him about a client whose project I had just secured. People are counting on me. You have flexibility, at least. That sentence lodged in my chest. I had flexibility. My time, my work, my needs became the adjustable part of our life, something that could bend around his schedule without breaking. Except that it did break, quietly, invisibly, inside of me. Conversations turned into briefings. Damon stopped asking how I felt and started telling me what needed to be done. Pick up my suit. Call the contractor. Reschedule the dentist. My days filled with logistics that made his life smoother, while mine felt thinner and thinner. When I tried to talk about a design concept I was excited about, his responses were shallow and distracted. Sounds good, he would say, without looking up from his laptop. You always make it work. The worst part was not intentional cruelty. Damon rarely insulted me outright. The worst part was dismissal. He treated my thoughts like small talk and my efforts like automatic functions. One night, after I carried in 3 heavy grocery bags and he did not pause his call to help, I stood in the kitchen staring at the stainless steel sink, feeling ridiculous for the tears burning the back of my eyes over something so ordinary. I told myself I was being dramatic. I kept telling myself that for years. Our life looked flawless from the outside. We lived in a high-rise condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the lake. We showed up to events in coordinated outfits, Damon in tailored suits, me in dresses I chose carefully to match his image of success. We smiled for photos, clinked glasses, hosted dinners with polished place settings. People told us we were that couple, the one who had figured it out. None of them saw the way he scrolled through emails while I talked, or the way I quietly stopped trying to be heard. There is a difference between compromise and erasure. I was not unhappy because Damon worked hard. I was unhappy because somewhere along the way, I disappeared from his story. I became the person who made sure there were clean shirts, booked flights, handled bills, and kept track of holidays. He became the person whose time mattered, whose exhaustion mattered, whose vision mattered. Mine became negotiable. If I felt tired, he called it cute, and told me I had no idea what stress really was. By the time Sierra appeared, the marriage was already hollow. She was not the earthquake that broke something solid. She stepped into the empty space that had been left unattended. I met her once at Damon's office holiday party. She was polite, efficient, and attentive. She laughed at every joke he made, finished his sentences, handed him a fresh drink before he even asked. I watched them interact from across the room and felt a quiet, heavy certainty settle in my stomach. The night I found proof of the affair was not dramatic. Damon had left his laptop open on the dining table, screen glowing in the dim room. I was on my way to bed, turning off lights, when a message notification appeared. I did not go looking for secrets. They appeared on their own. Sierra's name. A heart. A line of text that echoed something Damon had once said to me. I only feel understood when I am with you. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the trackpad. Then I sat down. It took less than 5 minutes to see everything I needed to see. There were inside jokes about my routines. Comments about how I would not get it. Plans that used to belong to Damon and me, trips, dinners, a potential house in the suburbs. Now discussed as if I had already been erased and replaced. They did not sound like people who had just crossed a line. They sounded like people who had stepped over it a long time ago and made themselves comfortable. I closed the laptop slowly, as if any sudden movement might cause something inside me to crack open. My hands were steady. My breathing was not. I stood there in the quiet condo, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic several floors below. I expected rage. I expected hysterical tears, a storm of questions. Instead, what I felt was a deep, clean clarity. Damon had made his choice a long time ago. I was only just catching up to it. Damon came home late that night, smelling like expensive cologne and the faint scent of perfume that was not mine. He loosened his tie as he walked through the door, set his keys in the bowl on the entry table, and launched into a monologue about a client dinner that had run long. He did not look at me closely enough to notice anything different. I stood by the kitchen counter, listening to him talk about market projections and investor interest, as if we were business partners, not spouses. When he finished, he asked, "Did you get the email from the contractor about the bathroom?" I told him yes. My voice was calm. My eyes were clear. He did not see the shift. To him, my silence read like surrender, like acceptance, like the quiet he had trained me into. To me, It felt like stepping out of a room that had been suffocating me for years and closing the door behind me. I did not confront him that night. I did not show him the messages. I did not ask questions I already knew the answers to. I knew how that scene would play out. He would deny, minimize, blame, stress, accuse me of overreacting. I would cry, he would go cold, and I would end up feeling foolish for caring. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer the next morning on my way to work. I slid the business card into my wallet and carried it like a key. In the weeks that followed, I began to undo my life in quiet steps. I collected financial documents, printed account statements, and moved certain items into a file box in the back of my closet. I opened a separate bank account. I stopped sharing my thoughts with Damon, stopped volunteering details about my day. I answered questions with simple facts. I no longer tried to soften his stress or anticipate his needs. It did not take long for him to notice something, but he misread it. "You are distant lately," he said one night, looking at me over the edge of his tablet. "Work getting to you or something?" I held his gaze for a moment and shrugged. Something like that. He accepted the answer because in his mind, my inner world had never been something he needed to understand. He assumed my quiet meant compliance, that I would adjust, as I always had, to whatever new shape his life took. He did not consider the possibility that silence could mean departure. The day I packed my bags, the sky over Chicago was gray and low. It was a Tuesday. Damon thought I was working from home. I moved slowly through the condo, taking only what belonged to me. Clothes, books, my grandmother's jewelry, the box of sketches I had kept from design school. I left the furniture we had picked together and the dishes we had bought on sale. I left the heavy dining table, where we had hosted other people's admiration, but not our own connection. Damon watched me place the last suitcase by the door. He had come home early, confused by the sight of open drawers and empty closet shelves. "You are actually doing this," he said, as if it had only now occurred to him that I was not performing some brief rebellion. "You are really leaving. You are this calm about it." I picked up the handle of the suitcase and met his eyes. "I am calm because I have already left," I said. "This is just the part you can see." 2 weeks after that final dinner in the restaurant where he once promised forever, I drove away from the city we had shared and headed east toward Harbor Pine, North Carolina, a small coastal town where my grandmother had lived for most of her life. The house she left me sat on a quiet street, 2 stories of weathered brick with a small front garden and roses climbing along a stone wall. When I pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon light made the windows glow. The first night there, the silence felt almost too big. No television in the background, no elevator chimes, no neighbors' footsteps above. Just the soft rush of the ocean in the distance and the creak of the house settling around me. I carried my suitcases inside, set them in the front room, and stood in the middle of the living room, listening to my own breathing. For the first time in years, there was no one whose approval I needed to earn, no one whose schedule I needed to work around. In Harbor Pine, no one knew who I used to be. At the grocery store, I was just another person debating which brand of coffee to buy. At the small cafe on Main Street, I was the new one in town, whose name the barista repeated until he got it right. The first time he said, "Good morning, Jasmine." Without checking the cup, something in me loosened. I was not Damon's wife. I was just myself. The days started to fall into a quiet rhythm. I woke up early to the pale light coming through the curtains, made coffee in a kitchen that still smelled faintly like my grandmother's spices, and walked down to the shoreline. The beach was narrow but steady, the water a constant gray blue that matched the sky more often than not. I walked with my hands in my pockets, shoes crunching over shells and small stones, letting the air clear the noise from my head. People often talk about starting over as if it is always terrifying, as if it is proof that something failed. Standing in that old house with half-unpacked boxes and sunlight spilling across the floor, what I felt most was relief. My muscles unclenched. My thoughts slowed. There were no plans I had to defend, no dreams I had to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. The emptiness of the house felt less like loneliness and more like possibility. After a few weeks, once the boxes were mostly unpacked and the garden had begun to accept my presence, I started looking for work. I had a master's degree in interior design and years of experience I had never fully been allowed to use. In Chicago, my career had been something that flexed around Damon's. Here, it could finally stand on its own. One afternoon, I walked into a small design studio downtown called Shoreline Interiors. a narrow storefront with large windows and models of renovated cottages in the display. The owner, a man named Calvin Turner, greeted me with a firm handshake and a curious tilt of his head. He asked what had brought me to Harbor Pine. I told him I was starting a new chapter. He did not ask for details. Instead, he spread my portfolio across his desk and studied the drawings with genuine interest. "Walk me through this one," he said, pointing at a concept I had once sketched for a brownstone we never bought. For the first time in a long time, someone leaned in when I spoke. The interview did not revolve around my marital status, my flexibility, or whether I could handle long hours supporting someone else's dream. Calvin asked about my style, my process, the kinds of spaces I felt most at home designing. When I mentioned that I loved bringing warmth into small, overlooked rooms and creating spaces where people felt seen, he nodded slowly. "We need that here," he said. "We get a lot of vacation homes, but not enough real homes." I left the studio with my heart beating faster in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. A week later, Calvin called and offered me a full-time position. "You have an eye for what people do not know they want yet," he said. I would be foolish not to bring that in. Work became my anchor. Every morning, I walked from my grandmother's house to the studio, passing the same bakery, the same hardware store, the same dog tied to the same bench outside the post office. Inside the studio, I lost myself in fabrics, color palettes, floor plans, and client meetings where my ideas were not dismissed or minimized. Calvin gave me real responsibility almost immediately. He assigned me to lead the redesign of a local in that had seen better decades. At the first meeting, the owners, an older couple who had run the place for 30 years, sat across from me at the worn wooden table and listened as I explained how we could preserve the history of the building while making the rooms feel brighter and more welcoming. When I finished, the wife smiled at me in a way that felt like a quiet blessing. "I trust you," she said. The words settled deeper than she could have known. Outside of work, my life in Harbor Pine was simple. I cooked for myself, adjusting recipes I remembered from my grandmother. I pulled weeds in the garden and watched the roses climb higher along the wall. I bought a new set of sheets that I chose only for myself, pale blue with a subtle pattern that reminded me of waves. I read books I had owned for years but never had the time or mental space to open. Some nights, I sat on the back steps with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sound of the ocean and feeling something close to contentment. I did not stalk Damon's life online. I did not replay arguments in my head or rewrite conversations I wished I had handled differently. When stray memories appeared, his laugh from early days, the first apartment, the anniversary dinners, I let them pass through without clutching at them. Healing was not a sudden light switch. It was a gradual shift, like my eyes adjusting in a dark room until shapes slowly came into focus again. The news of Damon's upcoming wedding reached me the way most things from my old life did now, through my friend Tiffany Moore. She called one evening while I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Her voice carried that careful tone people use when they are trying not to cause additional harm. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she said. "The wedding is next Saturday. It is being held at a big venue in Manhattan. Apparently, the guest list is full of people Damon wants to impress." I waited for the familiar tightness in my chest, for the sting behind my eyes, for the sharp slice of jealousy. None of it came. I felt a brief pause, no more intense than the pause between breaths. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Tiffany started listing details she thought might matter. How expensive Sierra's dress supposedly was, the custom invitations, the imported flowers. Her words blurred together. I stared at the steam rising from the pot and realized that whatever Damon did now lived in a world that no longer overlapped with mine. That same day, my life moved in its own quiet orbit. I spent the morning walking along the coast, the wind pushing my hair back from my face, the sky a clear, sharp blue. I stopped at the cafe where the barista knew my name without checking the cup. In the afternoon, I knelt in the garden, dirt under my nails as I planted herbs I wanted to cook with later. While they rehearsed entrances and practiced vows, I was deciding whether to plant basil near the tomatoes or in a separate pot. Somewhere between the cafe and the garden, a realization settled over me like a soft, steady weight. I did not need updates, photographs, or gossip. I did not need to know if the cake was 3 tiers or 5, or whether Sierra cried when she walked down the aisle. Their celebration belonged to them. My life belonged to me. That separation was clean. It did not feel like loss. It felt like freedom. On the evening of the wedding, I invited a few co-workers over for dinner. We ate at my grandmother's old dining table, mismatched plates, and simple food. Calvin came, along with two of the junior designers and the receptionist, who brought a pie she had bought from the bakery down the street and pretended she had made it. We talked about work deadlines, travel plans, and a neighbor's endlessly barking dog. At one point, someone told a story that made everyone laugh so hard we had to put down our forks. While laughter filled the house, I thought briefly of a ballroom in Manhattan, then let the thought go. The story could have ended there for me. A wedding I did not attend, a life I had already outgrown. But sometimes the past circles back, not to pull you into it, but to show you a reflection you did not know you would ever be allowed to see. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was making coffee. Tiffany's name appeared on the screen. This time, her voice held no careful cushioning. "Jasmine," she said. "Are you standing or sitting?" I smiled faintly and leaned against the counter. "I am standing," I said. "What happened?" Tiffany took a breath. "There was an unexpected guest at the reception," she said. "Someone who knows you." She explained that Damon's father had invited an old business acquaintance, a man named Leon Grant. Leon had known my grandmother years ago, back when she visited the city more often. He was loud, charming, the kind of person whose voice carried even when he did not intend it to. According to Tiffany, near the end of the reception, Leon sat with a small group of guests at a round table, a half-empty wine glass in his hand. The band was playing something slow, and people were milling around the room. Leon started talking about a recent trip he had taken down the East Coast. Somewhere between stories about traffic and weather, he mentioned a small coastal town in North Carolina. Harbor Pine. "That is where my old friend's granddaughter lives now," he said. "You should see what she has done with that house." Tiffany told me how guests leaned in as Leon talked about me, how he had stopped by the house on his way through town, how impressed he had been by the garden, how I had turned the place into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Someone at the table asked if I was just visiting. Leon laughed. "No, she lives there now," he said. "Her grandmother left her the house. She is thriving." Then someone, loosened by alcohol and curiosity, joked, "She must be doing well for herself." Leon waved his hand. "She is set for life," he said. "Her grandmother left her a fortune. Millions." Tiffany paused on the phone, letting the weight of the word hang between us. I closed my eyes, feeling my heartbeat slow rather than speed up. In the Manhattan ballroom, Damon and Sierra were standing close enough to hear every word. From there, the rest moved the way news always does in rooms full of people who measure themselves by comparison. The joke turned into a whisper, the whisper turned into a murmur, and the murmur spread from table to table. The ex-wife Damon had discarded was not struggling in a small rented apartment somewhere, nursing regret. She was wealthy, independent, free. And the groom, Tiffany added quietly, was in debt. At first Damon froze. Tiffany said he kept the same polished smile on his face, but his eyes went distant, as if someone had pulled a rug out from under his thoughts while his body was still catching up. Sierra's hand tightened around his arm. Her expression, usually carefully arranged for photographs, stuttered, shock, calculation, something like annoyance. Guests around them glanced back and forth, picking up pieces of the story and stitching them into their own version. Someone asked a question that should never be asked at a wedding. "Is that true?" Damon turned toward Sierra, not gently, not like a man sharing private amusement with his bride. "What did he mean?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "About millions?" Sierra tried to laugh it off. "You know how people exaggerate when they drink," she said. "He is probably just telling stories. Why does it matter?" But the doubt was already there, lodged in the spaces they had reserved for admiration. Then another guest, someone from the finance world, mentioned quietly that there had been rumors about Damon borrowing money recently, just enough to cover some shortfalls. "Nothing big," he said, "but enough to raise questions." That was the moment, Tiffany told me, when Damon's control slipped. His voice rose. Glasses rattled on the tables. He demanded to know who had said what, why no one had told him that Leon knew me, why this was happening on his day. Sierra reached for his arm, whispering that people were watching, but Damon was already too far gone. He grabbed a champagne flute off a nearby table, his hand closing so tightly around the stem that the glass shattered. Blood streaked across the white tablecloth and dripped onto the floor. Someone screamed. The music stopped abruptly, instruments hanging in the air. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence that made every word that followed impossible to ignore. Tiffany said Damon started shouting, about loyalty, about respect, about how he had been made to look like a fool. "You knew what she had," he yelled at Sierra. "You knew, and you still—" He did not finish the sentence. Instead, he flipped a nearby table. Plates crashed. Food splattered across the floor. The towering cake stood untouched for a heartbeat before someone bumped into the table and sent it tumbling. I imagined the image. White frosting, expensive flowers, sugar decorations breaking apart on the tile. Guests backed away, some trying to help, others pulling out their phones almost by reflex. Parents rushed toward Damon. Staff stood frozen, unsure which catastrophe to handle first: the injured groom, the destroyed cake, the panicked bride. Sierra's dress was stained. Her perfectly arranged hair had loosened. The headpiece she had chosen so carefully tilted sideways. Tiffany did not need to describe Damon's face in detail for me to picture it. The same look he got when a deal collapsed, but this time with the whole room watching. "You should know," Tiffany said quietly, "that people recorded everything." By the time guests were in their cars, she explained, videos of the incident were already in group chats and social media stories. A groom screaming, tables overturned, blood on a white tablecloth, a bride crying while people filmed instead of comforting her. The image did not need a caption. It told its own story about control, or the lack of it. Within days, the footage had reached Damon's business partners, clients, and investors. People who had once talked about his discipline and composure now forwarded the video with questions. Meetings were canceled with vague excuses. Scheduled calls were postponed indefinitely. Contracts that had seemed secure were suddenly under review. No one wanted to explicitly tie their decision to the spectacle at the wedding, but reputation rarely needs a formal explanation. According to Tiffany, senior employees at Damon's firm started to resign one by one. They took clients with them, preferring stability over a leader whose public meltdown had become a public example. Sierra stepped back from public view almost immediately. The pregnancy she had reportedly mentioned with pride before the wedding was suddenly never brought up again. Where there had once been admiration and envy, there were now whispers and distance. Tiffany told me that Damon began showing up at the office looking thinner, older, his shirts looser on his frame. He started drinking more heavily, according to people who still moved in those circles. Deals slipped through his fingers. Calls went unanswered. He seemed to live in a constant state of bracing for the next piece of bad news. As she talked, I listened. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt removed, like I was hearing about a stranger's unraveling. This was not punishment I had orchestrated. I had not exposed him. I had not sent screenshots or confronted Sierra in public. I had not whispered in anyone's ear. This was simply the natural outcome of choices made in arrogance and secrecy, collapsing under their own weight. People like to call that karma, as if it is some mystical force that chooses targets. I saw it more plainly, cause and effect, unfolding on its own timeline. While Damon's world shrank, mine quietly expanded. I stopped receiving updates about him, not because people stopped talking, but because I stopped asking. At the studio, Calvin began assigning me larger, more complex projects. When I presented designs now, clients took notes and asked detailed questions. Colleagues sought my opinion without checking if someone else had already approved it first. My value was measured by what I created, not by how well I supported someone else's schedule. One afternoon, Calvin called me into his office. Swatches of fabric and blueprints covered his desk. He leaned back in his chair and regarded me with a thoughtful expression. "You have been holding this place together more than you realize," he said. "I want to give you a raise and have you take the lead on the new hotel renovation down by the harbor." I nodded, trying to respond professionally, but on the walk home, the gratitude rose inside me like warm water. It was not loud or showy. It was steady and earned. At home, the garden was in full bloom. The roses along the wall had climbed higher than I thought they could. The herbs I had planted were thriving, their scents rising whenever I brushed past them. Each plant felt like proof that consistent care, even when no one else is watching, leads to growth. In the evenings, I cooked meals that I actually tasted instead of eating distractedly over the sink. I signed up for classes I had always wanted to take: ceramics, photography, a weekend workshop on color theory. I took short trips on my own, driving to nearby towns just because I felt like seeing something different. I walked through small museums, sat in diners with worn booths, listened to strangers talk about their own lives. No one was waiting at home to ask where I had been or why I was late. No one needed me to explain why I wanted what I wanted. I slept better. I woke up without the heavy dread that had once greeted me like an unwelcome roommate. In quiet moments, I found myself thinking less about Damon and more about the version of myself I had been with him. The woman who believed that love required endless sacrifice, that being good meant being smaller, quieter, easier to manage. I realized I had not simply left a marriage. I had stepped away from a version of myself that might have vanished completely if I had stayed. Freedom did not arrive in the form of someone else finally apologizing. It arrived in the simple realization that my life did not have to be lived in reaction to another person. Damon once told me, years ago, during an argument about work and time and priorities, that I would struggle without him. "You would not last a year on your own," he said lightly, half joking, half not. "You are not built for all this pressure." Standing in my grandmother's kitchen now, surrounded by plants I had chosen, furniture I had arranged, and projects I had earned, I understood how deeply wrong he had been. It was not that I had suddenly become stronger. It was that I had finally stopped handing my strength over to someone who could not see it. I did not win anything. There was no scoreboard. What I gained was ownership of my time, my energy, my choices. I no longer adjusted my reactions to keep someone else comfortable. I no longer tried to twist myself into the quietest possible shape to fit into someone's story. My life was not a consolation prize for being discarded. It was simply mine, in a way it had never fully been before. Months passed. The town cycled through seasons: spring rain, hot summer afternoons, the crisp chill of early fall. At Shoreline Interiors, the hotel project near the harbor began to take shape. Walls were knocked down. Light poured into spaces that had been dim and neglected. I walked through the site with contractors, pointing out details, answering questions. The first time a guest checked into one of the finished rooms, the owner called to tell me that they had loved it. I hung up, sat on the edge of my bed, and let the satisfaction settle quietly. Every now and then, someone from my old life would call or send a message with a small update about Damon. His company downsizing, another former colleague leaving, a rumor about him trying to start something new in a smaller city. I skimmed the messages, then moved on. His story had become background noise to mine, a faint station I might hear if I tuned just right, but that I no longer had any interest in listening to. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the houses across the street, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the light turn everything gold. The kettle whistled. My phone rested on the counter, face down, silent. For the first time, I realized there was nothing I was waiting for. No message, no apology, no acknowledgement. The quiet was not empty. It was full of my own decisions. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.